Welcome back to a brief history of Ukraine. So, like last time, there'll be some sensitive content discussed later, but I'll post some timestamps below if you want to skip it. Here's part 2 if you missed it. Without further ado, let's commence. By 1939, the world stood on a knife's edge. The rise of a certain mustached dictator and his aggressive rhetoric of pan-Germanicism and anti-Semitism alarmed Europe. As the USSR watched, as Austria and Czechoslovakia fell to the Third Reich, they wondered if they would be the next victim of Nazi aggression. In the Far East, Imperial Japan stood poised to threaten not only Siberia, but the whole of Asia. It was alleged that Stalin believed an Axis invasion of the USSR was inevitable, and thus sought to buy time by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, dividing Poland in the process. On the 17th of September 1939, the Red Army stormed into Poland from the east and partitioned the country with Germany, just like in 1795. Galicia now lay under Soviet control, and both the Ukrainian and Belarusian Soviet Socialist republics were enlarged. In 1940, the USSR would then go on to annex Bessarabia and Bukovina from Romania, fulfilling what was seen as the final reunification of long-lost Russian territory. Almost immediately, the Soviet authorities launched a limited Ukrainization effort to counteract Polish influence in the region and allowed Ukrainians to positions they had previously been denied under the Polish regime. Schools were forced to teach in Ukrainian alongside Polish, and ethnic Poles were gradually locked out of public institutions or were simply deported. The entirety of Galicia would soon be subject to deportations, mass imprisonment and suppression, especially around concerns of an OUN resurgence, as Stepan Bandera had escaped from prison and fled to Germany during the Polish invasion. On the 22nd of June 1941, when Germany finally invaded the Soviet Union, many Ukrainians initially welcomed them, seeing them as liberators following the horrors they had to endure over the previous decade, though they would later be proven horribly wrong. Ukraine itself was a key part of the German Lebensraum doctrine, wherein living space in Eastern Europe, free of Slavs and other races seen to be inferior, was essential to German survival. By late 1941, after a series of catastrophic failures for the Red Army, most of Ukraine lay under German occupation and was placed under control of a civilian administration known as Reichskommissariat Ukraine, headed by fervent Nazi Erich Koch. Parts of Ukraine were once again partitioned. For example, Galicia was given to the general government in occupied Poland. Many Ukrainian nationalists, initially friendly to the German regime, saw this as a backstab and sought to violently resist the German occupation, the OUN included. Bandera's followers, soon labelled Banderites, were turned on by the Germans and arrested in scores, whilst other anti-German factions of the OUN began a guerrilla campaign against the German army. Germans weren't the only victim, however, of OUN attacks. The ethnic Polish population of Galicia suffered extensive ethnic cleansing as over 200,000 people were mercilessly killed by the Banderites, although Bandera's personal involvement in this is still contested to this day. The Soviets would also be at the receiving end of guerrilla attacks by the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which was the unified armed wing of the OUN. Initially seen as less of a danger than Russians, many Ukrainians were enlisted into anti-partisan and security battalion units, of which many would be complicit in the Holocaust. In fact, many of Auschwitz-Birkenau's guards were Ukrainian collaborators known as Tchorniki. Much of this may have moral ambiguity, as most collaborators were rarely ideologically committed to Nazism, and instead believed it to be the best way to protect their lives and families. This discussion of willing complicity versus absolute necessity is a debate that still rages today. For example, the Ukrainian contribution to the Holocaust, combined with the bloody legacy of the OUN, has served as a basis for Putin's claims of a neo-Nazi government and the subsequent need for denazification in modern-day Ukraine. In any case, the Jewish population suffered extensively, with as many as 1 out of 6 Jews killed being from Ukraine. The Babin Yar massacre in particular is perhaps the most infamous single atrocity of the war in Ukraine, resulting in the deaths of over 30,000 Kievan Jews in a single day. This was not the only atrocity carried out by the regime. The Germans, unlike those in 1918, were determined to strip Ukraine of everything it had. Under Erich Koch, Ukraine was plundered, with much of its agricultural produce requisitioned for the German war economy, whilst thousands of Ukrainians, Russians and others were sent to Germany as Ostarbeiter, or Eastern workers. In fact, 80% of Ostarbeiter were Ukrainian in origin. The horrors of the Nazi regime would continue until the eventual defeat of Germany would put an end to the concept of Lebensraum. Though they had been freed from the brutality of the Nazis, the people of Ukraine once again found themselves answering to another dictator. Only until the death of Stalin in 1953 would there begin to be some respite. After the war, the Soviets were faced with the task of integrating the land they had claimed under the Yalta Conference. They had also been allowed to keep the territories assigned to them under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, as well as Carpathian Ruthenia, taken from Czechoslovakia. Now, Ukraine was no longer a border territory, but lay firmly in the heart of the Soviet sphere of influence. As Soviet control over these territories had been limited even before the war, Sovietization was essentially carried out from scratch. People living within the newly acquired lands were unused to the demands of Soviet Marxism, and violent resistance by the UPA continued to 1950, ending after their leader, Roman Shukovich, was assassinated. Ethnic Poles and Ukrainians were forcibly relocated to their respective countries in order to create clear ethnic boundaries and dilute existing minorities, a tactic which, as we've seen before, was commonplace before the war. On the international stage, the West had acceded to Soviet requests for both the Ukrainian and Belarusian SSRs to be given their own seats in the United Nations, so that Soviet proposals would not be instantly outvoted by non-communist states. For the rest of Ukraine, conditions were in a dire state. The Soviets immediately prioritized the restoration of heavy industry, ignoring rising food shortages which would lead to eventual famine once again. Despite Soviet industrial investment, Ukraine's agriculture lay in complete ruins, not reaching its pre-war output until 1960. Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Ukrainian Communist Party at the time, attempted to organize limited relief efforts, but to no avail. Ukrainian nationalism once again remained a common claim used by Moscow to justify brutal repression of personal liberties in Western Ukraine, only toning down once Stalin died in 1953. In 1954, the administration of Crimea was transferred from Russia to Ukraine. On the surface, this was done as a token example of the unity between both states, but in reality it was done pragmatically, as Crimea's economy was thought to benefit far more from Ukrainian support. Such an action would have rippling consequences, as we shall see later. Stalin's successor, Khrushchev, began his de-Stalinization initiative with the secret speech of 1956, condemning Stalin's actions and ushering in a period of relative liberalization for the Soviet Union. Over the course of the Cold War, Ukraine would not only see its economy grow and undergo significant cultural development, but would also solidify its status as the second most important Soviet state alongside Russia. Various Ukrainian factions, such as the Dnipropetrovsk faction, were integral to the various support networks within Moscow, and this gave Ukraine far greater political leverage than the average Soviet republic. Presidents such as Brezhnev in 1964 owed their support to this faction. Influential figures such as Petro Shelest played an important role in intertwining Soviet and Ukrainian culture, yet the result was still distinct from Russian identity. Brezhnev's rule as a whole was characterized by relative stability and economic stagnation, as the West invested far more into weapons development than the USSR could match. Even so, Ukraine remained not only at the heart of the USSR's weapon and space program, but also was an integral center of academic learning across the Union. After Brezhnev died in 1982, two more Soviet leaders would succeed him for short periods before being finally replaced by Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985. Whose legacy in Ukraine and Russia is still extremely controversial to say the least. From the destruction of Nazi conquest to the ever-dominant rule of the USSR, Ukraine's road to independence was long and bumpy, yet many Ukrainians would never cease believing in something greater. So that was part 3. I hope you enjoyed. Part 4 will be the last part, this time I promise, so look forward to that. If you did enjoy, do leave a like, comment and subscribe, I'd really appreciate it. Now go grab yourself some toast or something.